Hey everyone, and welcome to the Ethnically Podcast, the show dedicated to amplifying diverse voices in every industry across society. Have you ever felt like your story wasn't being told? Here at Ethnically, we celebrate the journeys of those who defied expectations and carved their own path. We delve into the unique experiences of ethnic communities and the incredible things they've done to leave their lasting impact on society. My name is Adarsh Ramchurn, founder of Ethnically, and each week you'll hear inspiring stories of people who broke down barriers and redefined success. You'll hear stories of resilience, innovation, and the power of community. Whether you're an aspiring creator, entrepreneur, changemaker, or someone who just wants to see a more equitable society, the Ethnically Podcast is your podcast. Make sure to follow the podcast on your preferred podcasting platform so you don't miss an episode. Now, get ready to be inspired by journeys that are anything but ordinary. So, let's get ethnically. Welcome to episode 4 of the Ethnically Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Grace Mosuro, who is founder of Acquaintz Consulting. Grace, how are you doing today?
I'm really good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on today's podcast. To start with, could you share a bit about your background and what's led you to founding Acquaintz Consulting?
For anyone that can't see me, I'm a woman. I'm Black. I was born in Nigeria. I moved to the UK when I was 5 years old. And I have worked in a range of sectors, but probably been in leadership for the last 10 years and found it somewhat challenging to progress up the ladder. So I found that I had to leave organizations to take the next step in my career, which many women from the global majority identify with as that being kind of their lived experience. And then in 2020, obviously we had George Floyd's murder, which was quite a powerful time for the world. But for the UK, it was my first experience of race ever being something that we were free to talk about in the workplace. So that was quite a powerful and enlightening time for me. And then later in that year, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So I had an additional intersecting identity added to my identity as a Black woman. So I am now legally disabled for the rest of my life, as defined by the Equalities Act, because I have had cancer. And one of the things that I was really keen to do, having had an experience while I was having my treatment where a consultant made a comment that said, oh, you know, now that you've had cancer, it's going to be really difficult to get a job. And it was a really weird comment that she said, like, while we were doing small talk. And I said that I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to do next in my career. And that was her response. And it really just, I would say that was probably the icing on the cake in terms of the kick up the bum that I needed to start the consultancy. I was like, actually, she's not wrong, but this shouldn't be a reality for people with intersecting identities, that they've got to worry about which parts of themselves they reveal to their organization or to an organization for fear of being discriminated against because of that. I'm Black and I'm a woman. Those are things that you can see quite clearly. So I can't deny those aspects of myself. But in that appointment, I was considering whether or not I was going to deny my experience as a cancer thriver. And that's really what kind of kicked me up the bum to do what I do now.
Amazing. I mean, it's an inspirational story, and I think Noah's story is inspirational about going through challenges, and we all face challenges, but I think the way you sort of dealt those experiences, and I feel like I'm kind of similar in a way of using sort of people's feedback, and if they've kind of been saying things that they shouldn't really have said, but it kind of, you interpret it in a way that makes you want to do something different. And kudos to you for setting up the consulting
Thank you.
business. And I know like it's definitely having a lot of positive impact, which we'll touch on in a bit. But yeah, I think taking that sort of feedback from someone and actually using it as positive motivation, I think is in itself is inspirational. And yeah, we're going to get into a lot more around the work that you're doing and the impact that you're creating. But as a consulting business, and obviously in your work, you kind of emphasize moving from good intentions to real impact. That's kind of one of your main sort of lines and slogans. But what would you say are some of the common pitfalls when it comes to companies that are trying to implement D&I initiatives, and how do those companies sort of avoid falling pitfalls?
I think the biggest pitfalls is being reactive when it comes to DEI. So many organizations, they kind of go with the flow in terms of, whatever the current trend is with DEI. So if organizations are deprioritizing it, then it becomes a knock-on ripple effect where other organizations are like, oh, well, if it's not important to everyone else, then we can remove that from the budget. And then we might have a change of government like we have with Labour, who now have really prioritized DEI. I've seen loads of organizations now scrambling to get DEI back on the table. But then we have what's happened in the United States and, organizations that have parent companies in the States, for example, who are defunding DEI or deprioritizing it or making it illegal or completely scrapping it. And we're seeing that now kind of potentially have a knock-on effect in the UK with the likes of Google, for example. So for me, I think the biggest setback is not being strategic, right? Diversity and inclusion is something that should be built into organizations' DNA in the same way that leadership development is, in the same way that compliance is, for example. People are always going to be part of organizations and they are going to continue to become more and more diverse. So it's really important that organizations prioritize creating inclusive organizations that attract and retain and look after diverse talent. So yeah, my big thing is, and the thing that I work with organizations to do is to think more strategically about diversity and inclusion. So what is your inclusion strategy if you have one? How does that align to your why and your overall strategic objectives as an organization? And how do you bring your people along so that what you then deliver actually represents the needs of your organization and your people, as opposed to, this is what that other company over there is doing, so let's do that too.
I'll definitely agree with kind of pushing it as more of it should be sort of part and parcel of an organization strategy anyway. But I think with the way that organizations are going, there's not that, some, like you said, Google, for example, or some of the big companies in the US trying to scrap it, not really seeing the value in D&I, which is obviously completely wrong, because D&I should be embedded in strategies across every single part of a business. And like you said, be the same as leadership. It should be the same as compliance. It should be one of those fundamentals that we see in everyday business. So I think those are definitely things that we should definitely stress when it comes to businesses. And it's good to see that you're kind of pushing that agenda forward in the work that you're doing. And obviously you've worked with sort of a range of different clients, different businesses. What would you say is the way that you sort of tailor your approach depending on the strategic objectives of each business? Or are some businesses just completely oblivious to D&I, or some that are trying to make the right steps but just falling apart? What is your main approach when it comes to dealing with different clients?
So my main approach is really getting across the fact that each client and each organization is bespoke. So traditionally, companies come to me and to my colleagues with an idea of what they want. And the first thing that I'm doing is understanding why they want that or why they think they need that. So I encourage organizations to let me start off by understanding what they've done historically. So doing a bit of a deep dive is what I call an inclusion audit. So what have you done historically? How has that worked? What have your people said? How do your people feel today? What are your aspirations around diversity and inclusion? Why are those your aspirations? And what do you need to do to achieve those goals? And how do we build that in as being a strategy for the business? But also, I'm really passionate about equipping organizations with the tools to continue to drive that change forward once I've gone. So really thinking about who is responsible for diversity and inclusion in the organization, but how do you build it into KPIs company-wide so that everyone becomes responsible for it rather than sometimes one individual in a team. So yeah, that's how I usually approach it, is really taking that personalized approach of businesses.
Yeah, and I guess that's probably like the right way of going about it, because no business is the same. And I think
Exactly.
some businesses are further along the journey while some are haven't even started the journey. So I think it's that definitely probably the approach that I think personally for me would definitely sit right with me. But I think it's good that you're tailoring it to each individual company.
Mhm.
In terms of like, one of the big things I want to discuss on today's episode is kind of the wider landscape of diversity and inclusion from like a development point of view. When you're looking at organizations, and across sort of the last 15, 20 years, we've seen so many different inclusion strategies and ways of trying to implement change when it comes to diversity and inclusion. What would you say are some of those biggest changes that you've observed within the landscape of diversity and inclusion? And what would you say is like the biggest challenge probably in the next sort of 5 to 10 years that you see?
I think the biggest thing that we've seen is the impact of gender equality policies and prioritization of that in the DEI space. So women have come a really long way in terms of where they are within organizations and the positions that they take up, which I think is fantastic and testament to the value and the impact that prioritizing DEI can have. I think that where we're seeing the current kind of pushback against DE&I, particularly in the state, is because over the last few years, organizations have tried to, or there has been an emphasis, more of an emphasis on things like race equity and how do we create equity and inclusion for people from the global majority. And I think that we did start to see the needle moving, nowhere near as much as it needs to, but we started to see the needle moving. And I think that's why we've had the pushback that we've had, is actually some people don't want that change. I think when we particularly look at some of the things that were done to Black and brown women in the States that took up really high profile positions that were then labeled as DEI hires, almost, in fact, not almost, completely negating all of their lived experience, but also academic and professional experience that actually made them more than qualified for those roles. I think over the next few years, in the short term, particularly, we will see organizations continue to choose a side. So whether that side be, kind of just becoming compliant to what leaders in the States are saying around making DEI initiatives illegal. And we'll also see organizations that actually truly understand and believe in the value of DE&I really digging their heels in and saying, no, actually, this is not just the right thing to do morally, but this is also the right thing for our business. This is what our people want, including our employees and our customers, and therefore we're going to continue this work. So yeah, I think that's what I see over the next few years. I think we're going to have two different sides, and it'll be interesting to see which side makes the most progress. I think it's, one of the things we're all aware of, or we should all be aware of now, is, Gen Z and Gen Alpha are Gen Z already in the workplace, and more of them will be coming into the workplace. But also, my daughter's in Gen A, and Generation Alpha, and I am really, I'm scared for organizations once she walks into the workplace, because they are learning from millennials and Gen Z. And millennials were the first generation to really start to challenge the status quo. And Gen Z have come in after us, got all guns blazing. I think Generation Alpha are going to be extremely spicy, which I'm excited to witness. But we also know that Gen Z are the most diverse population, the most diverse generation, right? Which means that organizations aren't going to look like they did when I was in the workplace. They're not going to look like they do now, even. And it's really important that we use our position in organizations and in this world today to create a world that looks and feels like them, but also welcomes them in.
Not 100%. I can definitely, from being a Gen Z myself, echo that point around driving that change. And I think on a previous episode of the Ethnically Podcast, I spoke to Isabella around Isabella Mascarones, who has her own consulting business around sort of youth voice as well.
Mm-hmm.
She spoke that Gen Z is already having that voice in organizations, and like you said, Grace, like we're going to see Gen Z voices not just heard but told, and being able to impact organizations, actually lead organizations. Probably we're already seeing that change already. And I mean, if we're seeing this in Gen Z, Gen Alpha is going to be a whole different kettle of fish, I would say. So that's definitely one thing I would definitely echo around the positive change coming from younger generations into the workplace. And hopefully we can sort of challenge the status quo and continue to do that. And you mentioned sort of leadership as well, in sort of how that's going to change. We're going to, like I said, we're going to see younger leaders coming through in the workplace. What would you say in terms of some of those leadership skills that a leader today, in order to implement better diversity and inclusion strategies, have a better culture in a workplace, what would you say a leader at a top company needs to have in order to make that a possibility and make that reality for their business?
I would say empathy, number one. There is something about being able to empathize with people's lived experience, even if it's not your own. So being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes to some extent, because I think only when you can, really dig into that emotion, can you then feel convicted to want to continue the work of DE&I. I think an appetite for continuous learning is also important, in the same way that organizations continue to diversify and change in terms of what they offer, in terms of legal requirements of them, etc. Your workforce is going to continue to change. And it's really important that leaders continue that learning around diversity and inclusion. What do different cultures do? How do they behave? How do they like to be led? What kind of leadership are they used to, and things like that. But also really understanding, over the last 10 years, the language that is used within DE&I has changed so much as well. When I was growing up, we only had, I think, LGB even. And in the last decade, we've had TQIA plus added to that. The language continues to change. A few years back, no one challenged the term person of color, but over the last year or two, people are asking to be referred to as being from the global majority.
Yeah.
So it's really important that leaders understand and appreciate that no matter what your job title is, a big part of your role should be diversity and inclusion. What do I understand that to be? How am I driving that in my role? How am I continuing to educate myself on what's happening? How am I leading from the front? How am I engaging with, employee resource groups within my organization? Who am I sponsoring? Who am I mentoring? How am I leading from the front with this?
No, I completely agree. I think, like you mentioned, emotional intelligence in terms of empathy and having that capacity to learn and integrate yourself within the workforce and into your company. I think, that's I completely agree with that. And I think that approach to learning, of like just wanting to learn and explore and understand every person and their culture and their background. I feel like, I know we touched on Gen Z earlier, but that's something that I love about my generation. Like, we love to learn about different cultures, explore the world, get to meet new people. And I think that's something that I can definitely see already will be integrated in Gen Z leadership styles. But I think for like current leaders today, I think having those qualities are really important, particularly when it comes to what you mentioned around intersectionality, around obviously people are diverse in so many different forms, with not just race, which I know is the focus of the Ethnically podcast, but sexuality, gender, disability, and other forms of intersectionality as well is really important to that leaders understand and actually get invested in, which we've spoken about. When it comes to sort of intersectionality, I know that's a lot of around the work that you do specifically as well. How would you say organizations are currently addressing intersectionality in their workforce, and what can they do to improve that further?
So at the moment, organizations are traditionally addressing it through workshops. So let's have a workshop that teaches you what intersectionality is and how, you support people with intersecting identities. What I'm not seeing enough of is building intersectionality into policies and procedures and considering that as part of recruitment decisions, hiring decisions, targets that organizations have, etc. But also even down to the types of benefits that organizations are offering their staff. How does this appeal to someone with intersecting identities? where are we looking in terms of recruitment, and are we thinking about intersecting identities when we do that? I think, one of the things that I've always been quite vocal about is that I think we need to move beyond gender equality policies, because I think they leave women with intersecting identities out, traditionally women from the global majority. And I think it's important for organizations to think about how are we building intersectionality into all of our policies. And I think that the challenge that we have with policies that only look specifically at one protected characteristic is that it then leaves whoever is driving a change. So if they've got an objective to increase diversity within, with people that have disabilities, for example, they are still going to be subjected to affinity bias, where if they are a white male, for example, and they're recruiting someone, they are still more likely to lean towards a white male who is disabled because there is an affinity there, right? Whereas if you completely scrap those singular policies and build intersectionality into every single thing, then it keeps it front and center for people. It forces you to think about who is making those recruitment decisions, who else needs to be involved, and who else needs to be heard. Where is your accountability, etc. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I think it's a really important. Like, I think it's important to, when it comes to inclusion, I think a lot of organizations are kind of still, having different workshops, different strategies for each so-called protected characteristic. When I think, like intersectionality is, I mean, that's probably one of the trends that I definitely think, say trends, but one of the things that organizations are definitely going to try and implement in the next few years, from some of the research that I've done. But I think there is still so many biases that come from having these protected characteristics in terms of strategies around sort of gender equality, race equality, disability equality. I think you make a really great point in terms of organizations having specific strategies and ways of combating discrimination through having strategies around intersectionality. So, it's definitely a topic that I think I would want to discuss a lot more on the podcast, because I think when I've had guests on the podcast, we kind of just spoken around like one specific protected characteristic. But I think when it comes to intersectionality in the workforce, I think I'm going to personally be having a lot more conversations around this. But it's great to start the conversation around intersectionality with you, Grace.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of advice for companies that are probably starting on the inclusion journey and probably maybe they want to look for consulting and maybe want to work with you, for example, or other businesses, for example, what advice would you give to those companies? Because I think one of the things when I speak to people around diversity and inclusion is they understand it from like the human level, but then from a company's level, they're like, oh, but is this a bit of a tick box, or am I doing this for the right reasons? And they'll have some of those misconceptions, which can be quite negative and quite harmful at times. So what advice would you give to companies that are looking to start their diversity and inclusion journey?
So I would encourage companies to steer away from only working with consultants that make them feel comfortable. Because what we're still finding, which is unfortunate, is that in DE&I work, companies are still scared of that discomfort feeling. So they will traditionally lean to working with consultants that they have an affinity with, right? So whether they've worked with them in the past, or whether they look like them, whether they have, maybe not worked at the same organization at the same time, but they have some type of affinity. And they don't necessarily look at actually, does this person understand what our business needs right now in this moment? And can this person provide academic, professional, and lived experience of the change that we're trying to implement? So that's one thing that I recommend. I'd also encourage organizations to not just go with consultants that say yes to what they ask for. You want to go with someone or with companies who challenge you, right? So you might have an idea of what you need, But I really encourage organizations to work with consultants who challenge you, who ask you, why do you need that? What have you done to really understand that this is a need for your organization? And how big a priority is this for you? Because I think it's all well and good commissioning people to deliver workshops, etc. But the worst thing for individuals and employees within organizations is sitting in a half a day workshop and then leaving that workshop and nothing changing.
Yeah.
It's really important that you work with consultants and you think about, I call myself an inclusion partner for organizations. So think about actually, how long are you committing to working with this person to support you to make sure that that workshop isn't a one and done, that there are future things that happen within the organization, that you are understanding the impact of the workshop, but also what else your people need and want you to do, so that you can create a plan for the next 12 months around how you're going to drive that inclusive change within your business, and also how you're going to evidence to your people why attending these workshops is worth their time and why responding to the surveys is worth their time. You know, that you're actually doing something with what they're saying and telling you.
I find sometimes, first of all, I absolutely love that answer, because those are the two things that I think that I would definitely want to stress. But one of the things I find with like workshops and surveys and all the work that goes behind consultancy around diversity and inclusion is that when I speak to colleagues at like previous organizations, they kind of come back with, oh, it was great to have that workshop, but that because it was a one-off, I'm going to forget about it tomorrow,
Yeah.
or forget about it next week. And I feel like it's having that sort of long-term, consistent project or strategy that really is embedded on a day-to-day basis rather than a one-off workshop, which I've sat in a few of those workshops, and whilst they've been really good for the hour or 2 or 3 hours I've had, it's not led to anything or not led to meaningful change.
Yeah.
And
I
so,
heard something the other day. I can't remember the exact number, but it was something crazy like workshops only lead to change in people for 12 days.
wow.
So
Yeah.
once that time has lapsed, we tend to revert back to our norm. So it's really important to build in consistent interventions that help keep DE&I front and center within organizations, whether that be lunch and learns, listening groups, workshops, coaching. I think coaching is such a powerful way to make inclusion front and center for everyone. So I offer 2 coaching programs to organizations. One of them is really looking at leaders that aspire to manage diverse teams and progress them, or aspire to manage more diverse teams. So they might have some diversity in their teams, but they want to increase that and they want to retain that talent. And then the other program that I have is around developing and supporting women from the global majority to progress in their careers and to overcome some of the challenges that they will have already experienced in their careers. And those coaching programs, the reason I love them so much is because they include workshops, so group workshops where everyone gets to come together and really kind of share some of their experiences and learn from each other. But they also include monthly coaching sessions. And those coaching sessions are what really embed that change. It gets people being accountable, setting themselves goals and objectives that they need to achieve between each session, etc. I think that's the only way that you really make inclusive change long-term in people's minds, is having those regular touch points, those opportunities to come together and share. And those opportunities also to speak really honestly about what they don't get, what they don't agree with, and what they struggle with.
Yeah, no, I think that comes back to your point around comfort and challenge. Around those are the two things, that piece of advice that you would have for companies, like getting out of your comfort zone. I'll tell you how, like from a personal point of view, how much it frustrates me when I see people, like the conversations and this idea of having uncomfortable conversations being a problem, when anything, it's the solution to everything that you want to try and change.
You always say the best leaders shouldn't want to be comfortable until everyone in their team is comfortable. People from the global majority, people with disabilities, people that identify as, having different sexuality, etc., they are uncomfortable pretty much every single day.
Exactly. Yes.
And their leader, why should you want to be comfortable if they're not?
And like this point around sort of one thing that really frustrates me is around like sort of the white tears and white fragility point of view, where there's I mean I could go on for days talking about this topic, but I just think having just removing that comfort, I think having just a space where you can challenge people and just have those uncomfortable conversations, because ultimately those uncomfortable conversations are going to lead to change.
Definitely.
I really really want to emphasize that point that you made, Grace, because I think it's super important for people listening or companies that are listening to the podcast to really get really understand. I think is super important. But no, that's really good advice around sort of companies. And I know we touched on a lot around your work and the things that you're doing and advice that you have for companies that want to progress further in diversity and inclusion. But I want to touch a bit more about you and your personal journey, because that's something that we kind of jumped into learning more about your work, but not necessarily about you as a person. And you did mention being diagnosed with breast cancer and how that's impacted your career. What has been your personal experience having cancer, and how would you say that's impacted you as a person and your resilience and how you approach your work?
It's interesting. I would say that there's nothing that will make you live like tomorrow's not promised than having had a life-threatening illness and surviving it. I think that it just, for me personally anyway, it's given me it sounds so cheesy, a completely different lease of life. Like I wake up every single day looking for joy and finding joy in every single day. I also wake up every single day intentional. Like one of the things that I try and do too much Monday to Friday in the morning is get to the gym. Like I love the fact that I get to move my body, because there was a point in my life where I couldn't, for example. So I think that for me has been really powerful. But I think also before my experience with breast cancer, I was very proud and I was very, independent. I was like, I can do it all by myself. I don't need help and this, that, and the other. But having to go through chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and surgery, it forced me to be vulnerable in a way that I never been in my life, and I'd never allowed myself to be. The trope of the strong Black woman was how I was raised. I was raised to, be strong, not show emotion, get on with things, not need help, not ask for help, not share how I'm feeling and things like that. So I love that I was forced to do that. I see vulnerability as a huge strength now, and I absolutely love it. So for me, it was really powerful in that sense, but also it's the reason that I do what I do now. It really convicted me that I'm here for a reason, and I want to make sure that, with whatever time I have left, hopefully I get to affect the world in a way where it's better off, having had me in it.
No, I love that. That's so powerful. I think that experience and seeing the positives that come from it. And I'm guilty of taking life for granted, and I think a lot of other people are. But I think, like you said, like you live every day, with that intentionality of bringing joy to people, having your purpose and delivering your goals and aspirations. And I think what you mentioned around having people around you to support you and your journey, I think is a really important point to touch on, because I think when I speak to people on the podcast, a lot of it's around them and what they've done and how they got to where they got to in their journey. But I think a lot of that's down to the people that you have, or the support that you have. And I think both of us in our respective careers wouldn't be where we are today without people that we've had to support us. So it's really powerful that you've taken those lessons from what's been such a difficult time and turned it into something really positive, which is some of the stories that I just love to have and love to listen to on the podcast. So thank you for sharing that, Grace. In terms of like your role as sort of a founder of the consulting business Acquaintz Consulting, and obviously I know you mentioned sort of the gym and being a gym enthusiast, and you mentioned your daughter and being a mum. You've got all these sorts of different roles. And actually one of my first episodes on the Ethnically Podcast was with Linda Attram, who she calls herself a mompreneur. So she has a business, she works on her business every day, but also she says her most important job is being a mum. And so she calls herself a mompreneur because she's like, doing both at the same time. In terms of, because there's a lot of sort of people listening from diverse backgrounds on listening to the podcast, how would you say, what advice would you give around managing your time and managing your own well-being? Because when we're talking about diversity and inclusion in particular, a lot of that work can be quite draining. It can be quite tough to motivate yourself every day to want to do that work. So how do you look after your own time and look after your own well-being?
Yeah, so doing this work isn't always easy. I've spoken to a couple of people about this. I would never describe diversity and inclusion as fun. It's not fun.
Yeah.
There are moments that we have that are beautiful, motivating, and just like almost validate the work that we're doing, right? They're the reason that we continue this work, but I wouldn't say it's fun. So one of the things that I'd really encourage people, I'm really big on filling my cup. So I genuinely believe that illness happens because we don't listen to our bodies and we don't honor our own needs sometimes. Which is why I go to the gym as often as I do. It's not because, I want to look like really buff, even though I'm glad that happens as, the more you go. But the reason I go is because physically my body changed as a result of chemotherapy, etc. Like, chemotherapy is the most toxic form of medicine like that anyone will probably experience, in the sense that you have it to kill off cancerous cells, but chemo, the drugs don't discriminate. So they destroy good, healthy cells as well as cancerous cells. So I essentially had to rebuild my body, and, I suffer from fatigue as a result of my treatment, etc. So going to the gym helps me to be my best self every day. I also think is really important. Like, it's taken years for me to learn this because no one taught me this, but I prioritize myself above everyone else now. And I never used to do that before cancer. Before cancer, everybody else was the priority and then I was last. But now, I've seen the impact that had on me physically and mentally. So I ensure that I take time out each day for me, which is usually going to the gym, if I'm honest. That's my thing. And that then enables me to be, good at my job, to be switched on, but also to be a present mom and to be a happy mom. I think that's so, so important. And I agree, like, for me, being a mum is my number one job. Like, I've got a whole life that I'm trying to nurture and protect. And that is so, so important to me. But I appreciate that in order to do that job and to do it well, I need to be alive and I need to be well. So that's why I prioritize my self-care. I think the other thing is, and this is something that I need to do more of myself, is having a tribe of people that are on a similar journey to you, that genuinely want to see you win. And I think particularly as a Nigerian woman, that isn't something we're raised to do. We're raised to be quite insular, not to tell people what we're doing and not to tell people our plans. And being an entrepreneur, that can make it very isolating. Like, who do you tell when things are going wrong and you haven't got a clue what to do next? But also who celebrates you when things are going really well and who encourages you to continue that work. So those are the things that I'd encourage people to do, is find your tribe, people that you trust and that you respect and that you can learn from, and share with them regularly. And also fill your cup. Find what gives you joy and what makes you your best self, and commit to doing something with that every single day.
Yeah, no, I think, filling your cup and finding your tribe is the two sort of main takeaways from that. I think particularly finding your tribe, because I think a lot of people, we assume when we talk about well-being, a lot of it's like, okay, going out for a walk, going to the gym, doing something like doing an activity. But actually one of the biggest benefiting factors of well-being is actually spending time with the people that are going to help you grow, going to be there to support you, going to be a shoulder for you to lean on. So I think that's such an important point to raise, because I think, especially being an entrepreneur, working for yourself, and obviously I can speak myself from being a podcaster, it can be quite lonely sometimes, just doing the work and not really knowing the value of your work and trying to do everything all by yourself. But completely agree. I think for those that are listening as well, finding your tribe and filling your cup are two incredible nuggets that I definitely want to emphasize. from Grace. I've got some summary questions because we're reaching the end of the podcast, but I think one of the things that I did want to touch on as we wrap up the podcast is those personal challenges that you faced. And if you had to pick one particular piece of advice, one particular takeaway, and just for context, a lot of the listeners on the podcast are probably Gen Z like me, early stages of their career. If there was one piece of advice that you could give to help them throughout their career, what would it be?
Putting yourself first isn't selfish. So do it.
I love that.
I think that, particularly when I was growing up, like if you chose to do something that was just for you, you were called selfish. And actually, I think that no one equips us to be adults. Like, I don't remember being warned how much chaos adulthood is. Like, there's bills to pay, there's people to look after, there's work to do, there's all sorts. Like, I wasn't told about all of this. And I think that it's really important to give ourselves space to appreciate that we are people, and that we will continue to make mistakes, and that we will continue to learn new things, and that we won't ever be the finished article. And I think just giving yourself grace, and prioritizing yourself is really important, because you can't be all things to all people if you're not everything to yourself first, right? And so that would be my encouragement for anyone that is entering adulthood or is an adult, is putting yourself first should be your number one priority, whether you're a mom, whether you're a dad, whether you are, you don't have any dependents, whether you've got parents, whatever. You can only be what people need you to be if you look after yourself. So I'd really encourage people to do that. And also pick your battles. I think sometimes we can feel like there's an expectation of us to, fight every fight. And that, particularly if you're from a marginalized group, it can be exhausting. It can be upsetting. And sometimes it can be unsafe. So I would just really encourage people to understand where you have power to affect change and use your power in that space. And if you do not have that power, then just observe and be aware and do what you can within your power, but don't put yourself at risk, whether that be mentally or physically. I think it's really, really important to prioritize yourself a lot of the times. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not, I prioritize myself, but if my daughter called me right now, even though I'm about to tuck into my McDonald's dinner, gourmet, she called me right now and said, Mom, I need you to do this or I'm in trouble, I would drop what I'm doing ahead for my daughter. But, there's a balance. It's really important that we just look after ourselves and just, it's not selfish to prioritize you.
I'm really glad you mentioned sort of the intersectionality point of that, because I think oftentimes when I ask people for advice, it's kind of like blanket advice that could be applied to anyone, no matter where they're from or their background. But I think when you mentioned being from sort of a marginalized community, for example, and look, if I said to my parents, I'm going to prioritize myself, they'll be like, what are you talking about? You're not allowed to do that. You have to look after the family. You have to look after us. And there are so many different layers. And I'm really glad you mentioned that around if something happened, like if your daughter needed you, you would drop everything and go. Because I feel like there's, for some reason, being from an ethnic community, there's more pressure on being there for your family, or I don't know, maybe I'm generalizing and speaking from my own lived experience.
There is definitely. I think that, I'm the eldest daughter in my family. So which means that if anything goes wrong, the buck stops with me. My dad's no longer alive. And so for me, it's even more important that I prioritize myself. I have to be successful, not just for me, but for everybody else. So I prioritize myself and my work because if this doesn't work out, or, if I don't continue to do this work, then if they ever needed me, I wouldn't be able to help. So, I think there's layers to it. And it's also really important to get that across to people sometimes is actually, no, I need to take this time out to do this. And in the long term, it will benefit you, but give me the space to do what I need to do.
And I think it's, dealing with that pressure in a way that helps you, like you said, in the long term, deal with those challenges. Because if you're not looking after yourself physically, mentally, you can't support
Exactly.
and be there for everyone else. So I really love that answer. Grace, it's been an absolute honor to have you on the podcast. And I've loved listening to every moment of your story because I think you've just said it as it is, one. And two, your inspiration and the journey you've been through has just been incredible.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you for being on the podcast. However, it's not the end of the podcast because like I said, before we jumped on the call, I've got a few rapid fire questions and a summary question from Vicky Mose, who is founder of Imagine How, who supports women going through menopause and aims to encourage companies, businesses, individuals to learn more about menopause and what it is. So we'll come to that in a second, but quick rapid fire questions. You have one word to answer each of these questions. What is one word you'd use to describe the biggest challenge facing D&I today?
Racism.
Okay, nice. The thing is, I would probe further, but I think keeping it to one word is how we would answer these questions. Actually, the next few questions you don't have to answer one word, but what would you say is the biggest career risk you've taken?
Working in DEI and talking about race.
Yeah. Why would I'm actually going to ask a probing question. Why would you say that's been the biggest risk?
Because I'm a Black woman, and we're not allowed to talk about that stuff.
Yeah.
It makes people uncomfortable, and it was a massive challenge for me when I first started doing this work. I was scared stiff because I was like, people are going to see me as a problem as opposed to seeing me as someone who's trying to fix a problem. And it's scary, as a Black woman, I don't have a safety net. I'm not part of the dominant culture here. If someone decided that they wanted to cancel me, they could do it quite easily. So for me, that was the biggest career risk ever is, should you be doing this work? Do people want you doing this work?
And I think just to echo that, like it's your identity that you bring your full identity to the work that you're doing. And I could speak for myself as well from an Asian background, like I bring my identity to the work that we're doing. It's more focused on because of the work around diversity and inclusion, which personally, I don't think it should be the case, but there are like people do see you like that. And I think, that does drive home the point around why you think it's a risk. So, thank you for that answer. And the last rapid fire question that I have for you is, what is one thing you want to be known for?
Removing barriers for people.
Nice.
Yeah.
I like that. Like I said, I would probe further, but I like the short answers because it lets people think. Yeah, I think it's a great way to sort of summarize the podcast. Before we go, I've got the question from Vicky for you. And essentially, it's a very simple question, but Sheila wanted to keep it simple just because she didn't know who the guest was going to be. And I wanted to keep it surprised. But her question is, what are your thoughts on menopause?
My thoughts on menopause is that going through menopause, it's an interesting one because I think there's more education that needs to be done on menopause. So because I was having chemotherapy and I used to have to take these injections for 3 years after my treatment as well, it put me into perimenopause. So perimenopause, from what I understand, is that really uncomfortable period where you have the hot flashes, you have the night sweats, you have really bad brain fog, you have all of the ugliness before menopause. And that is the bit that I genuinely think that organizations need to provide reasonable adjustments for in the workplace, because I used to be at dinner with someone and I would just randomly start literally dripping with sweat out of nowhere. And it was horrible. So I think there's education that needs to be done, actually, because I think that people group menopause as just being the whole thing. But, there are stages to getting to menopause. So I think that more education is still needed around menopause. I know many women that have entered menopause, which is kind of like the post period and being able to have children, etc., that phase, and absolutely love it, but I think that period that our bodies go through in preparation for menopause is a really ugly time. And then there are also some women who, don't like menopause. I know that because I went through perimenopause, I didn't enjoy it. It wasn't pleasant at all. So I think there's still a lot of education that needs to be done on it. And I do think that organizations should be making reasonable adjustments for people during perimenopause and potentially even into menopause.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer to the question. I think we discussed it a lot on the previous episode of the Ethnically Podcast with Vicky around actually some of the intersectionalities of menopause as well, in terms of how it impacts different ethnic groups, different ages, different genders, as well within sort of the female. So that's something that I think would be really good to kind of hone in on and increase the education around menopause. So thank you so much for that answer on that question, Grace. It's actually now your opportunity to provide a question for the next guest of the Ethnically Podcast. And obviously on the podcast, we talk themes around diversity and inclusion, representation, removing barriers, breaking down barriers, understanding people's stories of why they do what they do and how they got to where they got to.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're able to provide a question for the next guest of the Ethnically Podcast, what would that question be? Put you on the spot here.
Yeah. What would that question be? What does allyship mean to you? That's my question.
I like that. Do you know what? I always say this after everyone asks provides their question, but I've done around 20, 24, 25 episodes of this podcast, and not one person has asked the same question as a previous person. It's always been a different question.
Yeah.
So that's something I love about the podcast, but that is a great question. What does allyship mean to you? So I will be asking the next guest of the Ethnically Podcast that question from you, Grace. So
Awesome.
Thank you for providing that question. That brings me to the end of today's episode of the Ethnically Podcast. Like I said, Grace, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on today's episode. Thank you for being your vulnerable self, sharing your journey, sharing your story, and discussing diversity, inclusion, and the work that you're doing to really break down those barriers. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and stay tuned for more episodes of the Ethnically Podcast. And there you have it, another inspiring story on the Ethnically Podcast. Wasn't that incredible? If you have enjoyed this episode and have been loving the Ethnically Podcast, please give us a rating and review and let us know what you think. Make sure to follow Ethnically on all social media platforms from LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or want to join the Ethnically community or just want to reach out to me, please email me at adarsh.ramchurn@ethnically.co.uk. We've got another inspiring guest lined up on our next episode, so please make sure you hit the subscribe button and stay tuned. Until then, this is your host, Adarsh Ramchurn, signing off from Ethnically.